Hi everyone, my name is Kayla and welcome back to Kay's Hidden Shelf where we talk about books. Today we are doing another weekly wrap up. We're going to take a look at everything I read and it was a really good week. I managed to fit in so much more reading time this past week, so I ended up getting a lot more reading in, which is always great. And the reads I had were pretty great as well. I also ended up having a bit of a mixed bag of reading with my fantasy, but also some parenting stuff. So if you're not interested in that aspect, by all means skip it. I will have timestamps in for the video if you're not interested in hearing that book. But yeah, I am a parent, obviously, and I'm trying to navigate these stages of a toddler. And yes, I ended up picking up a parenting book for potty training, in addition to reading some grimdark fantasy, some cozy fantasy. So we're just going to go ahead and dive right in. First up is The Court of Broken Knives by Anna Smith Spark. Now, this is book one in the Empire of Dust series. Like I have been reading the last few weeks with this. I last ended off, I think, at a 50%, and I devoured the last half of this book in about 2 to 3 days. There is a pacing shift in this book. I did find the first half to be more of a slow burn, where the second half just takes off as events kind of come into play and characters start to move and things just start happening. But when they happen, they hit hard. In terms of the world, the characters, it is all bleak, and any hope that I could find was tainted at great cost or by insanity. And there is just a gruesome and yet fascinating view into the beauty of murder and killing within that insanity. There is just a very unique take in terms of grimdark. I've read Joe Abercrombie, and I know that there is, at least from what I can remember, some touching on the, not necessarily the beauty of it, but the normalization of how dark that book can go. And this kind of takes it to a different facet in the sense that it looks at that dark and gritty aspect of life, death and killing, in a sense of beauty, of necessity, of how life goes. But seeing the beauty in it was what really threw me. And when I say threw me, I should clarify that I just was not expecting that. I was expecting the bleak aspect. I was expecting it to be grim and hopeless and all of that, but I was not expecting to find a perspective that showed beauty in those areas. And it just helped to give it a refreshing feel to the storytelling, to the world, to the tone, but also allowed it to help balance the overall tone throughout the story. Now, before I continue to ramble, I wanted to break down what this story is about a little bit. We follow 4 characters: Tobias, who is a merc hiring soldiers to essentially complete a mission; Marith, who is one of those hired hands working under Tobias's company; Thalia, who is a high priestess and really hasn't seen or experienced life outside of serving her god; and finally Orhan, who is the equivalent of a lord or a counselor to the emperor and is plotting to overthrow said emperor. Aside from the tone and the perspective of beauty throughout those aspects of the world, I did want to mention the first thing that stood out to me was the prose. The prose is brief, direct, and yet poetic. So sentences are often short. They convey ideas in a very brief and concise yet effective way. And what worked for me was mixing the audiobook with the physical copy. And that's naturally how I read at this point anyway. I really enjoy immersion reading, but I think the audiobook allowed me to experience the poetry within that prose a little bit more than if I were to just have picked up the physical copy. That's not to say that I didn't experience any jarring, because I did when I initially started reading it, even with the audiobook, but by the second or third chapter in, I became more comfortable with the writing, the prose, and in the end, I think it added a beautiful tone to the overall story. Meanwhile, the characters did take me a little longer to settle into. Personally, I really enjoyed Tobias and Marith, both of their perspectives, their stories, and honestly, the psychology was really interesting, especially behind Marith's character. Both of them I was easily able to connect to in comparison to Thalia and Orhan. Now, Thalia eventually grew on me a bit more. She is quite naive to the world because she has been locked away for so long and her life has so many expectations that are very cruel to do to a human. And yet I took longer to connect with her. I did find it to be a bit more of a setup for what I believe will be a greater character arc or development for her in books 2 and 3. I can see the potential there for her character. On the other hand, though, Orhan was just infuriating for me. I did not care for Orhan's character. I can see the purpose behind his character, and yet I just could not connect with this character at all. His motivations, everything, he just felt like a very weak character to me. And that's not to say he's not written well. I feel like authors can still do a good job at writing a character, because the fact that I am infuriated by said character just goes to show that the author did a good job at getting an emotional reaction out of me. That being said, Orhan was still my least interesting or most infuriating character, I guess, depending on how you want to see it. I have some suspicions about his character, in similar to what I talked about with Talia or Thalia, but I'm gonna leave it here for now because I do want to keep this spoiler free. Essentially, I have a feeling he will still continue to be a character that infuriates me. Another aspect I enjoyed out of this was how the gray morality of these characters impacted circumstances, and it just created so many twists in the plot, and I just wasn't anticipating the directions that the book ended up taking. Even small moments would go different ways than I was thinking they would go. And the psychology of these characters was also fascinating. Now, I will say there are themes explored in this, and they are explored quite well, which is addiction, the meaning of living, and legends. These are just some of them, but these were the standout ones for me, and I do think that the author explores them really well. But I will say, if you do struggle with addiction, or if that's a trigger, this might be a bit difficult for you. Speaking of triggers, there is also quite a bit of violence. This is grimdark, and that violence does not stop at adults, so just keep that in mind as well. And of course, the action was great. It was gripping. It was brutal. Now, I do feel like this is still a debut. I can see in some ways that there's room for growth in her writing, and I'm very excited to continue with that being said, because there's so much set up here, there's so much promise, and there's so many things that she pulled off so well that I'm really excited to continue with the series and to see where our characters end up next. And in a complete change up of tones in reading, the parenting book I ended up picking up is Potty Training in 3 Days by Brandy Brooks. Now, this is about 112 pages, so it's a very quick read. I also picked up the audiobook so that I could listen while cleaning, and that was only an hour and a half. Very accessible, very quick to read. It was nice to actually put behind such a dark book. It was a very different kind of palate cleanser for me in terms of reading. And a lot of the information in this was actually quite helpful. We have yet to put it to the test, of course. We are planning to do that soon. But in terms of changing perspectives and tactics and things to try, very helpful. We've already started implementing some of the things that are recommended, and they've already helped in some ways with our son, so that's fantastic. So if you're a parent, if you're going through this stage, or you know you will be going through this stage, I would definitely think this is worth picking up, and I'm happy to do an update if anyone is interested to see how this turns out for our little one. But at the end of the day, even if you only take a few things out of this that help, I think that's worthwhile. After that, I picked up Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies by Heather Fawcett, again completely flipping on the mood here with a bit more of a cozy read. That being said, I did not realize when I bought this that it was a slow burn romance until I was halfway through the book, which is egg on my face, really. I picked this up because I heard fairies, folklore, and a female scholar who researches them. There is an entire department of dryology at Cambridge in this world that dedicates their time. Their professors go out on research studies to learn all about the fae. And to me, that was fascinating. I stopped reading there. I stopped listening to reviews there and just went and picked it up. Also, it is just a beautiful copy. So how could I not have it on my shelf? So yes, egg on my face when I got halfway through and realized it was a slow burn romance. Now I say that because romance can be hit or miss for me, and I do have mixed feelings about this book. I think in terms of the tone, it was able to balance wholesome and yet eerie and horrific really well. I absolutely love the atmosphere of this too, the landscapes that are described, just overall, it was such a wonderful read, very cozy. I really enjoyed it. And on top of that, I also related to Emily's character in quite a few ways, as she is quite a bit awkward in social situations. She much prefers to cozy up with her research, a book, and keep to her own company, or at least one-on-one conversations. Crowds, more than one person, is really hard for her to navigate and to understand social cues as well. So I related to her in quite a few ways, as I am very similar in the sense of enjoying one-on-one conversations, and group discussions can be a bit more intimidating for me. With that being said, she also has a rival from the university she works at, Cambridge. She is a professor trying to earn her tenure, and her research in completing the first ever encyclopedia of fairies is what she's hoping will get her there. The rival that she has at Cambridge is Bamblebee, and he is someone who very easily and seemingly effortlessly got his tenure. He has student apprentices, he goes on field studies. He seems to be quite lucky and very well off and has a bit of a pretentious attitude. However, she sets off on this journey to a village in the middle of the base of the mountains on God knows where, and she is determined to do this study, this field research on her own. And to her surprise, Bamblebee arrives shortly after she does to assist her with her research. And of course, shenanigans ensue. What I loved about this is that we get to see this type of awkward social person in a setting that has a found family. The villagers of the town that she is temporarily living in for the duration of her research are very harsh and hardy folk, and they have their own customs and ways. This is a different country, a different place in the world to Emily. And seeing her navigate those, the different social cues of culture, all of those things was really fascinating. And seeing how she navigated the found family that develops as well was really sweet and endearing. In terms of the relationship, the slow burn romance, that part didn't quite work for me. I was far more interested in her dog. I know that sounds terrible, but her dog has his own little air of mystery about him, and their bond was endearing. I really enjoyed it. In terms of the romance, like I said, it's hit or miss. In this case, it did not work for me. But there were so many other aspects that I loved within this book that it was still a good read for me, and I can see myself coming back for a comfort read. Now, there are some moments that felt a bit dramatic for my taste as well. Again, this is just leaning into that kind of fairy tale genre, I think, in terms of storytelling. But overall, it was a really enjoyable read, and I'm not sure I'll continue with book two. I am going to sit and think on that just because it seems like it might be a continuation of pattern in terms of storytelling. But of course, I can't judge that yet. I have not read it. Just from reading the back of the book, it seems like it might be a similar plan in terms of story and outline. But again, that's just a first impression, not actually having read it. In terms of the Encyclopedia of Fairies, book one, I do think it was enjoyable. It was the atmosphere and the fairies and the folklore that won me over, along with Emily's character. Though I'm not wholly sold on her character, I would have loved to see a bit more development for her. But in terms of everything else, I really love that. As a character-driven reader, I think this worked as well. Again, I would have liked to see a bit more development from her, but as a reader who also loves folklore, fairies, atmosphere. This was such a fantastic read. And finally, I'm about halfway through A Wolf in Thieves' Clothing by Lily Ann Crow, which is a novelette for SFINCS. It's only around 65 pages and I'm around 30, so it's going pretty well. I'm not going to attempt to give you a description just yet because I went in completely blind for this one, as I've done for plenty of the other SFINCS reads. And I will say that so far the first half of this is quite captivating. We get a hook right in the beginning that leads us into some interesting world building as well as plot. We have Fry, who is a thief being hired into a new gang for a mission, but I was fascinated to see that there's an entire, or seemingly entire, board game and card game implemented. There's an entire chapter that goes around a scene, but the scene is a bit of a gambling den and they have this entire game. It reminded me a bit of Gwent in The Witcher as an example or a comparison. It just seemed very well detailed, and I was fascinated to see that in a novelette with a much bigger plot. So I'm really interested to see where this goes and how this ends. At the end of the day, it's just gripping. The suspense is there. I'm really intrigued to see how it goes on, but it also starts with high stakes. So I went into this with that anticipation, that excitement, because it starts off with such a great hook. And that is everything I read this past week. At the end of it, I think I read somewhere around 600 pages, which is fantastic. It feels so nice to be back in the groove of reading a little bit. And I did find that it wasn't just a reading funk I was in, it was a bit of a reviewing funk as well, which was a first for me. So that was interesting to navigate because I didn't realize it until quite late into the funk. But I've got that energy back. I feel a bit more recharged and I'm excited for the next reads to come. I would love to know, what are you reading? How did your week go? Was there a new favorite or one that you're excited to pick up for this coming week? Leave your comments down below. I always love hearing from you. As always, thank you so much for watching and take care of yourselves.